last year. The two talks here last year. One was on emigration from this area, and the other was on land from this area, about land ownership. So when they asked me to come back this year, I thought it'd be something different. So the club, as you know, is called the Fontenoys. And for years I drove past it, I never knew what Fontenoy meant, hadn't a clue. And I actually talked to people and nobody knew what it meant. And then I found out this after the Battle of Fontenoy, which was fought in France in 1745. And the reason why the link is that the MacCartans who lived here after the Williamite Wars, the MacCartans were in exile. And all the MacCartans with Patrick Sarsfield and all the other Irish soldiers all went to France. And they fought in the continent that were called the White Geese. And they were fighting for the French against the English at the Battle of Fontenoy in Belgium in 1745. And it was the Irish Brigade who overturned the English at the last battle and won the battle for the French. So I went out, right, and I thought, this is a great talk. And I put all these books on the Irish Brigade and the Battle of Fontenoy and everything, and I got the whole thing ready. And I came in and said, what do you want me to talk about? And they said, the Annesley family. Right. And I said, what do you want me to talk about the Annesley family? Who's interested in the Annesleys? No, we want to talk about the Annesleys. So I said, well, that's all right. I said, the problem I have is I am not what's called a big house historian, right? I'm not widely interested in lords and ladies and all that. I'm more interested in ordinary people and how they did and what they own. But I said, I'm going to do the talk for you anyway. So I spent a long time researching the talk. Quite a lot of that from this book. People have asked me about books. This book is A Big Grey Castle. It's written by Robert Trotter, who is meant to be here tonight. Robert's meant to be here with a few books for people who are looking to buy them. So if anybody is interested in the Ansleys, this is Robert's book. Really, really good book about the family. You should look out for it. But when I was researching the Ansleys, I came across an unbelievable story. Probably one of the greatest stories that I ever came across in research. And it's the second part of this talk, and it's called The Earl and the Gardener's Wife. And when you hear this story, it will blow your socks off. It really will. It's an incredible story. But the big thing about the story is all the history books are wrong. Because I have researched this for the last 6 months, and I'm coming up with an alternative theory, which you're going to hear tonight. This will be the first time the word of this theory has come out. It's certainly the first time that leak from the theory has come out. But I'm going to give you an alternative story to what actually happened here. So, what do we before we go, Slade Creek responders, obviously there's donations for them tonight, and I want to thank you very, very much for your donations, not just tonight, but all the other times that people will come in and help them, because it's great to do, and they're very, very pleased that you've done that. So what to expect? What we'll do is we'll talk about the Lords of the Great Castle. We'll talk about how they came to Ireland in the first place, how they got Castlewellan. We'll do a wee brief on the 6 earls who lived here, and then a bit about Lady Mabel, who was really the last one in the sense of the family of the Landed and then a wee bit of the tenants. And then we go on about the gardener's wife. There's a story about Frances, who is the first Earl Annesley, and a lady called Sophia, and an alleged bigamous marriage. And then I'll talk about Frances and the will, and then the court cases, and then Sophia's life in Paris. So the first bit's about the Ansleys, in a sense, the Great Castle. The second bit is this story, and I guarantee it's a cracker. It's an absolute cracking story. So first Earl Annesley, first Annesley to come here was Frances. And the Ansleys had been in England for a long time. They're of Norman lineage, so they've been in England probably from the 11th century. And they came to Ireland in the 1600s, early 1600s. And the Ansleys were not soldiers. Lots of the English landed gentry that came here were soldiers. So they would have fought in English armies, would have beaten the English armies. The English government didn't have money to give them, so they took land off the Irish and they gave it to them. So people like the Hills of Hillsborough. Sir Moses Hill was a soldier in Queen Elizabeth's army, and he was given all the land around Lisburn, Kilwarren. Sir Arthur Chichester was a soldier in Elizabeth's army, and he got places like Belfast and stuff like this. The Ansleys were not soldiers, right? The Ansleys that come here were more lawyers, civil servants, administrators. But because they had worked for the kings and queens, they were granted land here. And they were granted estates down south. And then in 1619, they were granted what was called the Manor of Cloghmaracat, right? Which is Clog. I'm sure the people Clog or Clog, they have to put the letters into that name now. But they were granted land in around Clog. And so they were there before they came to Castlewellan. And they would have established Mount Panther. So Mount Panther, the big house that you see as you drive past there, that was the centre of that domain. They sell the land around there, but they keep the domain and they keep Mount Panther. And then subsequently it's sold. But the Ansleys who owned the Clog estates were never here, right? They would have taken rent off the people, but they never lived here. They were really absentee landlords. There's a shot of Mount Panther when the album was 1799, and you can see the house up the top there about the middle, and then you can see the road that actually runs past the house. So that big house that you see just outside Clog, up on the left-hand side, which is sadly destroyed now, that was owned by the Ansleys for many, many years. So how did they come then to Castlewellan? The land right here was owned by the McGinnis family. The McGinnis family were one of the lords of Ivey, and they had thousands of acres all around south and mid down. But over the years, because of different wars, the McGinnises were caught on the wrong side of the war. So the 9 Years' War with Queen Elizabeth, the McGinnises lost a wee bit of land. And then you get the war with Oliver Cromwell, the 1641 rebellion. One of the leaders in the 1641 rebellion was Sir Colin McGinnis. And lots of McGinnises fought in the 1641 rebellion. Oliver Cromwell comes, Cromwell beats the Irish, and the McGinnises lose an awful lot of land then. And then in 1660, Oliver Cromwell dies. He dies, and you get what's called the Restoration. And as you know, Cromwell cut off Charles I's head. When Cromwell dies, they bring back the monarchy. And when they bring back the monarchy, they bring back Charles II. And Charles II then is lobbied back in the Irish who lost their land and treated the McGinnises. They write to Charles II and they say, look, we stayed loyal to you, we stayed loyal to the monarchy, can we have our lands back? And very few of them got their lands back. But one of the families that did get their lands back were the McGinnises at Castlewellan. They got some of their land back on the proviso they would convert to be Protestants. So they converted Catholicism to Protestants, they wrote to Second Charge, and they got some of their land back. So they got Castlewellan back about 1660. But they're heavily in debt. They've still got sons to send to university, they've sons to send to school, they've sons to go to court, they've got dowries to pay out to all their daughters, and they start to run out of money. That's the letter there, which is the Public Record Office, and that's the letter there that's signed, where they ask for their money back. So the McGinnises get their land back, but they're really, really struggling for money. So they sell. And they sell Castlewellan, all the estate of Castlewellan to this guy. This is William Ansley, and he's the guy who buys Castlewellan in 1741. He doesn't really come here. He's living in Dublin, he's a lawyer in Dublin, but he actually buys the estate. That's his wife on the right-hand side, that's Lady Anne Beresford. Now she's big land in Jetbury. She's the daughter of the Earl of Tyrone. And the reason why I'm showing you the Anne Beresford, as we go through this story, you'll see these names pop up all over the time. The family are very, very connected. Very connected. So look where the Ansleys. Well, I always worry about saying these things. People think, you know, this is you sort of being bitter and twisted against people. Listen, I'm just going to say things how they were, right? This is Lady Gable's book, okay? And this is her talking about her own family. And what she said, my forebears had come to Ireland in Elizabethan days. If I am not English, I, like my forebears, am Protestant, and my flag is a Union Jack. I venerate good, long green, unimaginative Great Britain. So the Ansleys were very much landed gentry, Protestant, loyal, seen themselves more as English than Irish. And that's not unlike a lot of the landed gentry in Ireland at this point in time. So they weren't that much difference, but they certainly were part of what's called the Protestant ascendancy. They see themselves as the actual rulers of the country. That's a map which was done about 15 years after Yancey's arrived, that's 1755. And you can see the land around here. But if you look at the size of Clough, which is quite small now, Clough is actually bigger than Castlewellan, and Newcastle, which is in there, is actually non-existent. So you can see the way the land has shifted. As the families have moved about, the land has actually shifted. That's a better shot there, which is probably more, you see Castlewellan, that's the park. This is the 1831 survey map, and there's the lake, and you'll see at the bottom Castlewellan Cottage, just above the lake, and that was one of the Anthony's homes. So the big castle wasn't actually built here. So the Anthony's now are in Castlewellan, right? So the first Earl is this boy, Francis Charles. He's the eldest son of William and Anne, and he marries a woman called Mary Grove from Ballymohimmock in County Cork. She's an heiress as well, and he inherits her estates down in County Cork. He gets Anthony's, gets Castlewellan in 1770 on the death of his father. He buys Mount Panther back at Clough, and he builds Mount Panther. He's the one who adds the two big wings onto Mount Panther. And he is the first one created the Earl Annesley. So he's the first Earl Annesley of Castlewellan. The important thing about him is that he has no children within marriage. He dies childless. And once his wife dies, there's a panic about the title, because the title passes down the male line. So the title really should pass for him to his son. And in those days, if you had no children, the title would have just become defunct. So what he does, he takes out what's called a special remainder in patent, right? And what he does, he says, if I die childless, my brother, Richard, will inherit the title, right? So that's written in the law, and that means that if he dies, his brother becomes the second Earl Annesley. Now that's important as we go into the story. He's very Protestant, very loyalist, he's very British, he's County Grand Master of the Orange Order, he's a colonel in the Downford Militia, he's a colonel in the Castlewellan Yeomanry. But whilst he had no children within marriage, he had no problem having children outside marriage. And he had 4 children to a woman called Dorothea McElroy in Castlewellan. 4 sons to Dorothea McElroy, all illegitimate. And then he enters into, and I'll put it in here in italics, this bigamous marriage, this alleged bigamous marriage with the gardener's wife, and he has 3 children with her. So he now has 7 sons, but none within his first original marriage. And he dies in December 1802 in Mount Panther. Second Earl comes along, that's his brother, right? His brother's Richard. He's married a woman called Anne Lambert from Dunladdick, which is over near Dundonald. He doesn't live here, he lives in Dublin. He's a barrister, he's the head of the Commissioner of Revenue in Dublin. And he lives there. He's again sort of an administrator for the government. But he's involved in the Dublin Militia, he's involved in the 98 Rebellion down there. So these people are really involved in government. And how government works. 1807 he sells Mount Panther and he builds Castlewellan Cottage, and that's a picture of Castlewellan Cottage there. And that's right out at the lake. Now there's nothing there remains, that's completely gone. But that's the house that he built. But the Ansleys do pump money into here. And he starts to develop the domain. He's the one who builds the glass houses that you see. And he starts to develop the gardens. But he was really struggled with mental health. And in 1810 he has to retire with mental health issues. His son takes over. He's the 3rd Earl, William Richard. And he married a woman called Isabella St. Lawrence of Howth, right? Again, wealthy heiress. But he divorces her in 1821 to be infidelity. She runs off with a 19-year-old officer, a cavalry officer in the Hussars. So they decide to have a divorce. Now, a divorce in those days was a bit harder than a divorce in these days. These days, you want a divorce, you just go to court. In those days, you couldn't go to court and get a divorce. The only people who could give you a divorce was the House of Lords. So he had to petition the House of Lords to have a divorce. And to do that, he had to prove a thing called criminal conversation, right? So they had to set up this whole thing where Lady Isabella and her lover would go to a hotel. They would tell him they're going to a hotel. He would send people to the hotel who would record all the details down, going in and going out. And then he would petition the House of Lords and say, this is why I want a divorce. So he then got a divorce from his first wife. He inherits Castlewell on his father's death. And he marries Priscilla Moore of Eglantine, Lisburn. And Moore is another name of the Annesley's that keeps cropping up all the time. Doesn't like Castlewell Cottage. You can see why he don't really like it either, to be honest. So he builds Donard Lodge. So that's Donard Lodge you see the picture of. And Donard Lodge sadly is no more. I think it's the nicest of the Annesley houses by far. Donard Lodge set in Newcastle, up on the hill behind Newcastle, just overlooking where the harbour is. I think it was blown up in about 1961 because of Gabe Gurley. But he builds Donard Lodge and develops Donard Lodge, and he develops Newcastle. And he's the one who builds the first hotel in Newcastle, which is called the Annesley Arms, which is still there. Part of it is actually still there this day. He dies quite young, and his son inherits. Again, William Richard, but he inherits the title. He's only 8 years old, so he obviously can't run the place. He's far, far too young. And there's the name Moore pops in. Reverend Moore becomes the estate manager. So the Reverend Moore runs the Annesley estates while the young Earl is growing up. And he doesn't sit about. He's actually quite an active guy in and around Castlewellan. Castlewellan doesn't have a church. There's a church at Kilmagan. There's no church at Castlewellan. So he's the one who puts the tar on Castlewellan Market House to try and create a church. He's the one who starts to build a church in Castlewellan. He's also the one in charge during the famine. I did a talk about the famine or the Great Hunger and Gordon War. And everybody was interested to know, what did my landlord do during the famine? Was he good or bad or whatever? The Annesley were not in charge of Castlewellan during the famine. The person in charge of it during the famine was Moore, and he was fairly good. He did try to look after the tenants. He did work quite hard and try and do his bit. This guy's the guy who builds the castle. So the big grey castle that you see now in Castlewellan is built by this guy here. He employs a Scottish architect to build it, William Byrne, and he builds the castle. However, on the way to meet what would be his wife, and he's going to marry one of the Churchills, the Spencer family, Sir Winston Churchill, Lady Diana, all this stuff, right? On the way to meet her, to arrange the marriage, he dies, right? Actually on the way to meet her, and the land then is inherited by his brother. So you can see in terms of the Ansleys, it doesn't follow a normal line of father, son, father, son, father, son. It's now starting to move backwards and forwards across the family. This guy here didn't think he was going to inherit, obviously. He is the fifth Earl, Hugh, soldier, lifelong soldier, army officer. He fights in what are called the Kaffir Wars and the Crimean War. The Kaffir Wars were fought in South Africa, and they were against a tribe called the Xhosa, which spelled Xhosa, but it's pronounced Xhosa. Nelson Mandela was a Xhosa. He was a Xhosa. So this is the British Army fighting the indigenous people of Southern Africa at that time. He's wounded in those wars, comes back, recovers, joins the army again, and then Crimea happens. The Crimean War was fought roughly where Ukraine is now, and it was fought between the British and French on one side and the Russians and Turks on the other side. It was a disastrous war. It had never been fought. Everything went wrong. The tactics were wrong. It was full of disease. More people, soldiers, died of disease in the Crimean War than actually died in battle. But Hugh is leading his forces. He's a member of the Scots Fusiliers. He's leading them up the hill. It's what's called the Battle of Alma, one of the first battles of the Crimean War. And he's shot through the cheek with a musket ball. Musket ball enters his cheek, takes out 22 of his teeth and part of his lower jaw. And that's where you can see the wee black mark up on the top. And then he eventually grows a beard that sort of hides the disfigurement that he has. Very, very lucky to live. One of the other Ansleys dies of illness in the Crimea. So he gets ill in the Crimea, he dies in the Crimea, that's Robert. So he inherits on the death of his brother, comes back, takes over the estate, marries a lady called Mabel Markham, and he's two children, Mabel and Francis. And there, we'll come to the end there, really, we get to the end of the Anstey family, right? But Mabel dies at 33, he marries again, and he marries Priscilla Moore. And there's the Moores coming into the Anstey family. He's 61 and she's 22, so she's only a few years older than his daughter, and they don't really get on. They don't really get on at all. The big thing about him is all the trees and bushes that you see in Castlewellan are nearly down to this guy. This guy travelled the world, passionate gardener, buys trees all over the world, bushes, brings them all in from everywhere. So he's the guy who establishes all the trees and bushes. Also a pioneer photographer. Photography's just coming out. And his collection of photographs, which are in the Public Record Office, are astounding. They are absolutely astounding. So he leaves that legacy. But, like the Ansleys, he's very, very pro-landlord, very anti-tenant, very unionist. And all the bills that he votes against in the House of Commons are ones against tenants' rights. Because at this particular time, the tenants' rights movement is starting to take place where the farmers are starting to say, we want to buy our own land back. We want our land back. But the Ansleys do develop this place. They're not absentee landlords. Lots of landlords down part of the Southern Ireland were absentee, never were here. They developed Ballymacreek quarries. They were very passionate about Ballymacreek quarries. And in fact, the Ansleys, when their Houses of Parliament were being built in London, the Ansleys have written loads of letters to the government saying you should build a House of Parliament in Ballymacreek stone, right? And of course they don't. They built it out of sandstone, which is now falling apart in London. So they should have built it out of Ballymacreek stone. It lasted a bit longer. But they developed the harbour, they developed Castlewellan, and they developed Newcastle. So they do pump money into here in order to develop the place. That's Mabel Markham. And that's Lady Mabel there as a child, and that's Earl Francis up on the right hand side. So they're brother and sister, right? And that's Francis when he becomes 21. So that's his 21st birthday, coming of age. That's his father there, the one with the big grey beard. So Francis is now of age, and he becomes the 6th Earl. He's the only one who's born in the castle. Right? All the others are born somewhere else, but he's actually born in the castle. Bit of a sportsman, bit of an adventurer, he goes on sailing ships, he plays rugby, he plays golf, he gets involved in all sorts of things. And he marries a divorcee, and they have no children, right? And that becomes important. But he settles down at Castlewellan and starts to put more money into the place. But then war breaks out. War breaks out, he fights in Belgium with the army in Belgium, and then in 1914 he's going across the English Channel in this plane here. This is called a Bristol D-18. He's going across the English Channel and the plane was ditched in the sea. He's never heard of it again. So he's now gone, right? But he's gone with no children. At this time, before we come to Lady Mabel, things are really starting to happen for the tenant farmers, right? So these are the years when things start to switch from the landed gentry controlling everything to the tenant farmers now starting to back their land. And it's all because of this. Down in the top right hand corner is William Ure Gladstone. William Ure Gladstone has a minority government. And the only way he can stay in power is by using the 100 Irish MPs in the House of Commons. So the 100 Irish MPs in the House of Commons say, we support you, but we want something back for ourselves. And that's when things start to change. First thing changes is the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. The Church of Ireland, for centuries, was the government church. So people in the Church of Ireland were Protestant, right? Presbyterians are not Protestant. Methodists are not Protestant. Church of Ireland was the Protestant church. Presbyterians and others were called dissenters, right? But you had to pay a tithe to the Church of Ireland, whether you were Protestant, dissenter, Catholic, or no religion. It didn't make any difference. If you farmed land, you paid a tithe to the Church of Ireland. And people hated that, because you're paying to the church you didn't go to. So one of the deals they had was getting rid of the tithes. So he disestablishes the church. The next thing they say to him, the guy at the bottom right, who named Parnell, Charles Stewart Parnell, him and Michael Davitt, they turn around and say, look, Irish farmers, they're getting a rough deal here, right? So we want things called the 3 Fs, okay? And the 3 Fs were fair rents. Because at this stage, the landlord could put whatever he wanted on the rent. If he wanted to get rid of you, he just got the rent. You couldn't pay for the evicted, he got somebody else in. So we want fair rents. We want fixity of tenure. If we have a lease, we want that lease to hold. You just can't kick us off the land. And we have freedom of sale, which means that if we want to sell our land, we can sell it to whoever we want to. We don't necessarily have to sell it back to you. So Gladstone gives in, and he gives the guys the 3 Fs. So now we start to get a bit of fairness in the tenant system. But then they turn around and say, well, hang on a second, we need to buy our land. So they then introduce what are called the Land Acts. And the Land Acts really say to the landed gentry, the game's up, you've had centuries running this place, sell it out to the farmers, move on. 2 things happen. One is the landlords are not keen to sell, and the other thing is the tenant farmers have no collateral, so they can't get the money to buy the farm because they don't have collateral. So they bring in this thing called the Wyndham Act. What the Wyndham Act does, 2 things. It says to the landed gentry, if you sell within the next few years, we will give you the value of your land plus 16% bonus from the government on top of that, right? So we get the bonus to sell the land. And they say to the tenant farmer, you can now get a government loan. Don't have to go to the bank. The government will loan you the money over 66 years, which means it's probably cheaper than the rent, and now you can buy the land. And what you get then is the biggest land transaction in Europe. Millions and millions of acres of Irish land moved from the landed gentry to the tenant farmers during this period. The book that is there, it's the 1925 one, that, and anybody here who lives here, who's interested in their own particular farm, that's in the Public Record Office, that's the Annesley book that sells the land, and every farmer's is on that. I've seen the book, and loads of them, so every individual farm, it's listed on that, who bought it, how much you bought it for, and how many acres. So the last sort of the landed gentry, Annesley's, is this Lady Mabel Marguerite, right? She's born in Regent's Park, but she grows up in Castlewellan, loves the moors, loves around here. But she's a debutante. You know, she's brought out with the royal family. You know, she lives a really, really high-class life in London. They have a yacht and cows. And she's a great watercolour woodcut artist, right? But she marries for love. And she marries a guy called Lieutenant Gerald Sarley, who's a naval officer, who's no money, right? So she's the first of the Ansleys. They all marry very strategically to get more and more land. She marries this guy, who's very little money. They have a son called Gerald, and that son called Gerald lived out about 1961. I'm sure many people in here have probably met him over the years with stories about him. The sad thing about her is in 6 years, she loses her father, she loses her brother, and she loses her husband. They all died within 6 years of each other. At the same time, the Land Acts are going through, which are forcing them to sell the land. So she's now stuck in a difficult position. They'd already sold their Cavan estate. The Annals is a big estate in Cavan. It was sold in the 1880s. But they don't sell Castlewellan until about 1925, 1930. So they hang on to Castlewellan. They're one of the families probably held on to their land the longest in the whole of Ireland. They don't really want to sell. But it goes in around this time because she's got 2 sets of death duties to pay. She builds money. She always has the money for the sale of the land, and she also has rental income because they own lots of properties in Newcastle and Castlewellan. They try to make a go of it. They keep a couple of thousand acres, and they try to make a go of it. The thing not working out. She then leaves the land to her son Gerald, and she heads off. She lives in New Zealand for a couple of years, and then she goes to England, and she dies in England. She's buried in Bedford, Suffolk. And I have seen some of the houses she lives in, and they're just ordinary houses. Like we live in just an ordinary, like 3-bedroom house. So here's a woman who was born to the landed gentry, yachts and cows, debutante, everything, lived in a big castle. And she's the one that's really the alpha and omega of the Annesley family. She ends up just living in an ordinary house. The interesting thing is that she doesn't inherit the title, because the title goes down the male line. So when her brother Francis dies, he has no children, but she gets the land, but she doesn't get the title. The title goes sideways. And it's that old Major General in England who gets it, and then it moves and moves again. And I tracked the title down to about the 12th Earl Annesley, and the 11th Earl Annesley lived in somewhere like Birmingham, and he was a post office engineer. Right? So that's the way the title has gone sideways. So some guy who lived in a two-bedroom permanent post office engineer was actually the 11th Earl Annesley. So that's how the title. So let's look at a move from the Ansleys to people who lived here. People that don't see their own names. The Ansleys back in 1741. That's 1742. That's the list of all the Annesley tenants in 1742. Now, I can pop up this up anytime. Anybody's interested, I can send you a copy of this if your family's on it. But you can see all the names for Ben Ross, Sleep, Holy Leg, and Annie, Ballymacreath. And that's the 1742 list of the people who lived on the Annesley estate. That's one of the early Annesley leases, that's 1743, so that's only 2 years after they bought it. And you'll see William Annesley's name there, and James Henry, who got the lease up there. That's one of the first Annesley leases. Nearly all the Annesley leases are in the Public Record Office, right? The whole Annesley records are there, and they're fantastic. There's tons and tons of them. So anybody who can research into them, you're not stuck for resources and things are there. There's lots and lots of stuff there. But they lived in some splendour. They had balls, they had dances, they had all sorts of things. They had carriages and horses, and they rode downs. They enjoyed themselves. That's the cellar book of Richard in 1802. And you can see there, or 1832, you see the left-hand side, port, sherry, Madeira, claret, and then down there's the number of bottles drunk. So obviously the 4th of July, we're having a bit of celebration there. There's 10 bottles of port went, and 5 bottles of sherry, and 5 bottles of claret. So they lived a very, very good life. They really had a good time. That's the book of their estate workers. All these things are in the Public Record Office, by the way. That's the book of their daily estate workers. So that's not the permanent workers like the butlers and cooks and all that. Really what you have here is that's the people who work every day. And you can see all the names up there. And I'm sure if you were interested, if your family would work for the Ansleys, they'd be there. And there's the wages. And the wages were 6 shillings a day. 6 shillings a day for men, 3 shillings a day for women. Right? No equal pay. No equal pay. And no, certainly no equal pay. Women got half what the men got in those days. So how did you live? Well, slightly differently. Times were tough, right? The times were tough anywhere in Ireland, but they were particularly tough here because of the land, the type of land that was here. The farms were small as mountainous land. So we had turf fires, we had a bit of a ball, probably drinking potchie that was brewed up around the mountains, still in the mountains. You had evictions. The Annesleys were notorious evictors. They had no problem with their Cavan estate and on their Castlewellan estate. If you couldn't pay the money, they were very quick to put you out. And then there's the Castlewellan Fair, you've probably seen that photograph. And then you have hanging fairs, because families here, families couldn't support the number of children that they had, so they had to hire a So they'd have been hiring for Castlewellan. Big farmers would come in, big boys, girls, way to work. Or you had what called the Scotch harvest, where people would have left here to go to Scotland, to work in Scotland for the harvest, and then bring some money back. So life here was very rough. The picture in the middle is an actual Annesley photograph. Right, that's one of his photographs. It's called The Lennon Blacksmith. And I know exactly who that is, right? That's an O'Rourke. And I have his birth certificate and did all the researching around him. But I know that's an O'Rourke, because my builder is Seamus O'Rourke, and Seamus O'Rourke has his son, young James O'Rourke. And anybody that knows James O'Rourke, if you look at that particular photograph, that is James O'Rourke to an absolute T. That is 100% an O'Rourke. So that's the way things were. So let's get on to part 2, the big story. What I want to do here is write along and tell a story of a woman who I think has been, in a sense, left out of the whole equation of the Annesley story most deliberately. These are quotes from the books, right? And you can see the quotes. They went through a bigamous marriage, presumably the authorities wouldn't know about it. Lord Annesley married Sophia Connor illegally in view of her pre-contracted marriage to the gardener. The couple were bigously married. The couple went through a bigamous marriage, going through a marriage not valid. Every book says the same thing. They all say the same thing. But I want to prove them wrong here tonight. Alright? So let's start at the back and work forward. That's a letter that's in the Public Record Office. And it was written in 1850 from Paris. Right? It was written by this guy here. He's the head of the chief of police in Paris. And he writes this letter. And what he said is Sophia Kelly, who is the widow of Countess Annesley, who's widow of Earl Annesley, has died at the age of 80 years of age in Paris. And he's writing to Dublin to tell people of her death. She died here, in these apartments. They're called the Rue de Rivoli, which is down here in the Tuileries Gardens, in the most expensive part of Paris. That's where she died, right? So it fascinated me to find out who is this woman, because she's not really in any of the official Annesley records to any great degree. So when I went through and researched her, she actually comes up that she has at least 6 names. She's called Sophia Kelly, Sophia Talbot, Sophia something else, because I think she was married to somebody in the militia. Sophia Connor, Sophia Larry, Sophia Annesley, Sophia Lees. But in many names she's only married once. So how can she have 6 names, but she's only married once? She's born here. This is small town land just outside Omagh. And she's born here about 1775, 1776. Hard to say because there's obviously no registers. We've got to sort of work backwards, right? But you can see the townland, there's nothing else. Lived in a big castle, and she's the one that's really the alpha and omega of the Annesley family. She ends up just living in an ordinary house. The interesting thing is that she doesn't inherit the title, because the title goes down the male line. So when her brother Francis dies, he has no children, but she gets the land, but she doesn't get the title. The title goes sideways. And it's an old Major General in England who gets it, and then it moves and moves again. And I tracked the title down to about the 12th Earl Annesley. And the 11th Earl Annesley lived in somewhere like Birmingham, and he was a post office engineer. Right? So that's the way the title has gone sideways. So some guy who lived in a two down in Birmingham, post office engineer, was actually the 11th Earl Annesley. So that's how the title worked. So let's look at a move from the Annesleys to people who lived here, because people, if they want to see their own names. The Annesleys banned 1741, that's 1742. That's the list of all the Annesley tenants in 1742. Now, I can pop this up anytime. Anybody's interested, I can send you a copy of this if your family's on it. But you can see all the names for Ben Ross, Leaving the Bowley Leg and Annie, Ballymacreakin. And that's a 1742 list of the people who lived on the Annesley estate. That's one of the early Annesley leases, that's 1743, so that's only 2 years after they bought it. And you'll see William Annesley's name there, and James Henry, who got the lease up there, and that's one of the first Annesley leases. Nearly all the Annesley leases are in the Public Record Office, right? The whole Annesley records are there, and they're fantastic. There's tons and tons of them. So anybody doing research into them, you're not stuck for resources and things are there. There's lots and lots of stuff there. But they lived in some splendor. They had balls, they had dances, they had all sorts of things. They had carriages and horses, and they rode the hounds. And they enjoyed themselves. That's the cellar book of Earl Richard in 1802. And you can see there, or 1832, you see the left-hand side, port, sherry, Madeira, claret, and then down there's the number of bottles drunk. So obviously the 4th of July, they must have been having a bit of celebration there. There's 10 bottles of port went, and 5 bottles of sherry, and 5 bottles of claret. So they lived a very, very good life. They really had a good time.
That's the book of their estate workers. All these things are in the Public Record Office, by the way. That's the book of their daily estate workers. So that's not the permanent workers like the butlers, the cooks and all that. Really what you have here is that's the people who worked every day. And you can see all the names up there. And I'm sure if you were interested, if your family ever worked for the Ansleys, they'd be there. And there's the wages. And the wages were 6 shillings a day. 6 shillings a day for men, 3 shillings a day for women, right? No equal pay. Right? Still no equal pay, but no, certainly no equal pay. Women got half what the men got in those days. So how did you live? Well, slightly differently. Times were tough, right? The times were tough anywhere in Ireland, but they were particularly tough here because of the land, the type of land that was here. The farms were small, it was mountainous land. So you had to have turf fires, you had a bit of a bog, you probably were drinking potsheen that was brewed up around the mountains, distilled in the mountains. You had evictions. The Ansleys were notorious evictors. They had no problem, both in their Cavan estate and on their Castlewellan estate. If you couldn't pay the money, they were very quick to put you out. And then you've Castlewellan Fair, you've probably seen that photograph. And then you had hiring fairs, because families here, the families couldn't support the number of children that they had, so they had to hire them out. So there had been a hiring fair in Castlewellan. Big farmers would have come in, took boys, girls away to work. Or you had a thing called the Scotch Harvest, where people would have left here to go to Scotland, to work in Scotland for the harvest, and then bring some money back. So life here was fairly rough. The picture in the middle is an actual Ansley photograph, right? That's one of his photographs, and it's called the Leganany Blacksmith. And I know exactly who that is, right? That's an O'Rourke. And I have his birth certificate and did all the research in around him. But how I know that's an O'Rourke is my builder is Seamus O'Rourke, and Seamus O'Rourke has his son, young James O'Rourke. And anybody that knows James O'Rourke, if you look at that particular photograph, that is James O'Rourke to an absolute T. That is 100% an O'Rourke. So that's the way things were. So let's get on to part 2, the big story. What I want to do here is right or wrong and tell a story of a woman who I think has been, in a sense, left out of the whole equation of the Ansley story most deliberately. These are quotes from the books, right? And you can see the quotes. They went through a bigamous marriage, presuming the authorities wouldn't know about it. Lord Ansley married Sophia Connor illegally in view of her pre-contract marriage to the gardener. The couple were bigously married. The couple went through a bigamous marriage, going through a marriage not valid. Every book says the same thing. They all say the same thing. But I'm going to prove them wrong here tonight. All right? So let's start at the back and work forward. That's a letter that's in the Public Record Office. And it was written in 1850 from Paris. Right? It was written by this guy here. He's the head of the chief of police in Paris. And he writes this letter. And what he said is Sophia Kelly, who is the widow of Countess Ansley, who was the widow of Earl Ansley, has died at the age of 80 years of age in Paris. And he's writing to Dublin to tell people of her death. She dies here in these apartments. They're called the Rue de Rivoli, which is down near the Tuileries Gardens, in the most expensive part of Paris. That's where she dies, right? So it fascinated me to find out who is this woman, because she's not really in any of the official Ansley records to any great degree. So when I went through and researched her, she actually comes up that she has at least 6 names. She's called Sophia Kelly, Sophia Talbot, Sophia something else, because I think she was married to somebody in the militia, Sophia Connor, Sophia Larry, Sophia Ansley, and Sophia Lees. But in my mind, she's only married once. So how does she have 6 names, but she's only married once? She's born here. This is small townland just outside Omagh. And she's born here about 1775, 1776. Hard to say, because there's obviously no registers. We've got to sort of work backwards, right? But you can see the townland, there's nothing in it. A couple of farms and that's it. But she's born here, and she thinks she's called Sophia Kelly because she lives with a guy called Edward Kelly and his wife. He's a farmer. But when she's about 9 years of age, she says that somebody arrived at the house and came in and asked to speak to her and said to her, look, you're not really Sophia Kelly. These are not really your mother and father. They're only looking after you. Your father is an army officer called Talbot. He has left here and he's in America, making his money in America. And once he's made his money in America, he's going to send for you and you're going to live in some style in America. So we've now got Sophia Kelly, Sophia Talbot. And he gives her a wee bag of sort of jewels or baubles or whatever and says he sent these over to you and he's going to send for you, right? Time moves on. She's about 15, 16, and the Kellys decide that she needs to get married. So the Kellys bring in a guy called Patrick Campbell, who's a 60-year-old farmer from the next town, Land of Mullins, and they say, right, we've got a good match for you. Here's a man, his wife died a few years ago, but he's looking a new wife, and we think you'd be perfect for him. So I think we're going to get you set up here, right? She obviously doesn't want to marry a 60-year-old farmer. The prospects are not good. So she talks a young friend of hers called Arthur Maguire into putting her on a horse with him, and if he would ride with her to Drogheda, where they would catch the mail coach at Drogheda, and they would go to Dublin. Because in Dublin, in Richard Ansley's house in Dublin, are a couple called McVeigh, who are from her townland. They're working down there. So she thinks, if I can get down there to Dublin, the McVeighs, I can live with the McVeighs, and I'll escape from this fella, this farmer, Patrick Campbell. So she arrives down in Richard's house in Dublin. And she's living with the McVeighs, she's in Richard's house, but obviously she's a beautiful young girl, and she's being pursued all over the place by all the gardeners and the estate workers. Some of the people who are turning up at the house, some of the lords are turning up at the house, and the gardener chasing her around the garden. And at one stage she actually says Richard Ansley, propositioned her a few times as well. So she complains to the McVeighs, and they say, look, the best way to stop this is you're young, you're single, of course you're going to be chased, right? We'll put you through a sort of a marriage, because if you're a married woman, they'll leave you alone. So they arrange this fake marriage, as she calls it. They bring in a priest, a guy called Martin Connor, who's the gardener, and his brother, and the two McVeighs, and they all have a few drinks, and they say, right, we'll do this sort of fake marriage, and then we'll tell everybody you're married to the gardener, right? But she says that she didn't go through with the marriage. She thought she was getting a bit suspect, something was happening here. And about halfway through, she says, look, I don't want to do this. This isn't right. And Mrs. McVeigh pushes her into her and says, don't be stupid, don't be silly. You know, marry this young man. He's a good man, he'll look after you, right? So this is the marriage that they talk about, the O'Connor marriage. So you have two schools of thought. Martin Connor says it happened, the priest was there, they were married. Sophia says the priest was there, they were all drunk, she didn't do any of the responses, she didn't take part in any of it, they absolutely were not married, right? So this is what actually happens. There's no chapel, yeah, because we're at the end of the penal laws, there's no register, but the priest was meant to write it in his diary that he married the two of them together. After this alleged marriage happens, she goes back to Omagh. She stays with the Kellys for some time. Then she comes back to Richard Ansley's house, and she lives with Martin Connor for about 6 weeks, but she says not as man and wife. She's just in the house, but not as man and wife. Then things starts to change. On October in about 1795, Earl Ansley, remember him, the old fella? 55-year-old, no kids, 4 women and Mrs. McElroy. He's visiting his brother, right? And they're having dinner, and he goes down to the end of the drive, and he meets Sophia at the end of the drive. And they have a bit of a conversation. Obviously, she's not happy with her lot where she is. He's always had an eye for the ladies, so he says, jump into the carriage, come with me, and you can live with me in Dublin, which she does. She gets in the carriage and she goes to Dublin with him. Allegedly, she says, to look after children, but there are no children in the house in Dublin. But after a while, she becomes his mistress and they have a child together. So she's gone. And this is where you've got to remember in her story. This is someone who's born in a thatched cottage in Omagh with virtually no prospects. Had she married somebody in Omagh, She never would have been outside her parish. She probably was only at the local market town once every couple of months, had 4 or 5 kids maybe die, another 4 or 5 kids live. Nobody would know anything about her. She's now gone from this to living here in Dublin as the mistress of Earl Annesley. And he takes her everywhere. He takes her to balls, he takes her to the theatre. He's not hiding her, takes her everywhere, and they have a son together, right? And she's obviously living the high life. That's, how she gets another name, right? Annesley's notoriously Protestant. He hates papists, right? So he says to her, and this is the extract from one of the letters. He says to her, what's your name? And she says, Sophia Kelly. He said, I can't call you that. He says, that's a papist name. He says, have you any other names? She says, no. And he says, what do they call the priest? And she says, that was Father Ryan. He said, well, I can't call you that. That's a papist name. Well, Ryan. He said, what did you call the minister, Church of Ireland minister, who lived here? And he says, it was the Reverend Lowry. He says, I'll call you Lowry. So for about 3 years, she's called Sophia Lowry. And all the documents she's called Sophia Lowry. See, we now have another name for her, right? That's one of her original letters. She writes this letter about a month after she moves in with the Earl Annesley. And that's the actual letter in the Public Record Office. Now, the letter is full of spelling mistakes. It's grammatically incorrect. It's all over the place. She's drawn wee lines so she could actually write in lines. Now, the reason I'm telling you that, it's not to make fun of her, right? But it's to say to her, that's the level of education that she had, because this is important as we move through the story. You've got to get your head around, she's a farm girl. She really is born on a farm, very, very limited education. She's now in a completely different world, right? This is a bit like My Fair Lady or Shaw's Pygmalion. She's in a whole different world. And that's her letter. And there's her signature. Annesley moves her from Marlborough Street, where he lives in Dublin, up to Mount Panther. So she lives in Mount Panther. She dines with the Rodens. She dines with the Downshires. She dines with the Wards of Castle Ward. They're all running about living together. That's the back of Mount Panther. So Mount Panther wasn't too shabby an address for her. And that's the inside of Mount Panther. All sadly gone now. One of the most beautiful buildings in Ireland. But that's Mount Panther. This is where she's living. And that's her house in Dublin. She lives in Marlborough Street in Dublin. Now, their house, Annesley's house, isn't there, but that's one of the original Georgian houses in Marlborough Street. So that's where she's actually living in Dublin. But if you look across the road from where she lives in Marlborough Street, you'll see Waterford House. And Waterford House was the home of the Earls of Tyrone. So they're living quite close to the Tyrone family. To give you an idea of how she progresses over the years, that's her signature over about 5 years. So those are all her letters. I've read all her letters. That's the first signature you'll see. And as you see, as the years move on, it becomes much more refined, classier, whatever. So obviously, she's now starting to become a countess. She's now starting to become a lady and not a farmer's daughter. But everybody's okay with this, right? Because it's just saying, well, the old fella's having a bit of fun with this woman. Who cares? It's all illegitimate. Whenever he pops his clogs, Richard becomes the next Earl Annesley, will boot her out, and that's it all over. Until this happens. Francis writes to Richard and basically says to Richard, that's the letter there, that's a transcription. 57 years old, no intercourse with the family, no friends, I want to be comfortable for the rest of my life. I know your opinion, she's the gardener's wife, but I don't believe you. And I want to make a settlement with her, and I want to marry her. Right? So suddenly Earl Annesley is going to marry his mistress, right? Now that causes a problem. They get married in Mount Panther with some of the Annesley family there, who are the old Earl's friends and relatives, and they're married by the minister from Kilmagan Church. So they're actually publicly married, because some of the books say they went through a secret marriage. If you're having a secret marriage, you're not going to get married in the big house by the local minister. You're going to go to Las Vegas and get married by Elvis, right? You're not going to get married like this. So this is how sure Annesley was that he was on the right lines. After they're married, they moved back down to Dublin. Dublin at that stage was the second city of the empire. So they moved down there. Balls, theatre, concerts, the opera. All the big houses were there, parliaments there, so all the MPs are there, all the lords are there. Dublin really was a city of two parts. The Liberties was a complete shambles for anybody to live in, absolute slums. But the rich part of Dublin, Georgian Dublin, and even now is absolutely beautiful. This is the life she was living. But things are also changing politically. You have the 1798 rebellion lurking. You've got Napoleon lurking. You have worries about a French invasion. So Dublin is under partial martial law. You've got cannons, you've got militia running about the streets. All these things are actually starting to happen. But she's in the middle of this little farmer's daughter from Omagh. So to cut a tale of the tape, they have two more children. So at this point in time, our Francis, who had no children to his wife, right, his first wife, now has 4 children to Dorothea McIlroy and 3 to Sophia. The first 5 are illegitimate. But to give Francis his dues, he doesn't disown them. The first 2 boys, they're all called Annesley. They're all brought up in the house. They're brought up in Mount Panther, yeah. He has them when his wife's alive, right? That was another thing the book said. When old Earl Annesley died, he fell into the arms of this woman in his cups, and they had a couple of kids. No, all 4 kids were born when his wife was alive. If you look at their ages, it's just nonsense. And they were in Mount Panther, about Mount Panther. But he buys commissions for them in the army, right? Which was big, big money. He sends one to school in Edinburgh, and he sends one to the Navy as an officer in the Navy. So he looks after the top 4. The second one, George de la Poer, Beresford Annesley, is born after Francis and Sophia are married. So legally, he is the next Earl Annesley. The brother is not the next Earl Annesley, okay? Because circumstances have changed. 1802, the Earl dies. Earl Francis dies. And you'll see there, he dies at Mount Panther. And immediately Richard in the papers announces his brother's dead, and he's the second Earl Annesley, right? So he tells all the world, I am the second Earl Annesley, my brother's dead without issue. But he's not dead without issue because he has a wife with 2 kids, 2 legitimate kids. So what do? Well, they wait for the will. That's a copy of the will, right? That's in the Public Record Office, right? You can go and read that yourself. That's a transcription of the will. And this is where the shit really hits the fan, right? Because if you read the will, basically says, sell all my money, all my land, raise all my money, pay all my debts. And once all my debts are paid off, then the money is to be divided equally between James Henry Charles and Francis Annesley, sons of Dorothea McIlroy, William Arthur Annesley, son of Sophia Kelly, Lord Glen Rowley and Francis Charles Annesley, my sons by Sophia Countess of Annesley, my present wife. Nothing to the Annesleys. Not a juice. Everything goes to the 7 kids, right? When they read the will, they're all in Mount Panther. Richard is in Mount Panther. Sophia is in Mount Panther. Her kids are in Mount Panther. They're all in Mount Panther. What do we now do? Because what has happened is he's basically cut the family out of the will. So we have a meeting. And at the meeting, what you have is Sophia. At this stage, she's about 23 or 24 year old, right? Farmer's daughter, not a lot of education, on her own. Her husband, the only person probably protected her, is dead. On the other side in the room in Mount Panther, you've Richard Annesley, barrister, Commission of Excise. You've got Francis Beers, the land agent. You've got Richard's brother, who's the Dean of Dromore, William Annesley. His 2 sons who are army officers. And you've got Richard Annesley's solicitors. So you have 7 or 8 educated men in the room with a 24-year-old woman and 3 kids. And what they basically say to her is, catch yourself on. I know it says that, but catch yourself on. This is not going to happen. This is not going to happen, right? No matter what this says. She panics. And what she says is, look, I loved your brother, Francis. I loved him. We were in love with each other, and these are his children. But I sort of see the writing on the wall, and I'll not cause any trouble if you look after me and the kids. So you take looking after me and the kids, and I'll not cause you any bother, right? Which he agrees to do. So we seem to have an agreement, yeah? The guy in charge of the agreement is this boy, right? He's put in charge of the agreement. He's called John Claudius Beresford. Remember Beresford, the name? Yeah, pops up again. Mad as a bucket of frogs, right? Absolutely bonkers. Sonny Earl Tyrone, MP for Dublin, Lord Mayor of Dublin, made mad absurd speeches, absolutely corrupt. You could buy his vote, fiercely sectarian, fiercely orange. They said he was like a sort of medieval knight riding about Dublin, doing whatever he wanted. In the 98 rebellion, he's famous in the 98 rebellion for being really brutal on the rebels. He lifts people off the streets of Dublin. He tortures them and flogs them in his house in Marlborough Street, right? It's stables at the back of Marlborough Street house, and that's where they flogged the rebels trying to get information out of them. Now don't forget, Sophie's lived on the other side of the road from him here, you know? And this is the guy who's meant to be in charge of looking after the will. But he is Richard's cousin, okay? And he's landed gentry, and Richard is landed gentry. But he's meant to be an impartial arbitrator. What starts to happen is Sophia starts to see the writing on the wall. Literally within weeks of the old Earl dying and the whole agreement, I look after you, don't worry, Richard starts to sell everything around Mount Panther. So these are from the newspapers at the time. There's Mount Panther, all the stuff up for sale. And here you have the domain up for sale. And there you have Sophia coming into the paper saying, hang on a second, this is mine. This guy is actually selling property that was left to me. So we're now starting to move into the public domain. This whole argument starts to move here. Richard then kicks her out of the house in Marlborough Street, boots her out, and she goes to live here in Sackville Street in Dublin, which is now O'Connell Street. So she's now got to throw herself on her friends, the mercy of her friends, to try and look after her. And she has a lot of friends. She really has a lot of friends. Richard says, I will only let you back into the house. I will only give you money if you sign your name Sophia Connor. And why he wants to sign her name Sophia Connor? If she signs Sophia Connor, she's admitting she was married. She says, I'm not signing that. I am Sophia Kelly, or I'm the Countess Annesley. I'm refusing to sign. Because she refuses to sign her name Sophia Connor, he won't give her any money. And he kicks her out of the house. She goes to live here. So Richard's got to make a case. He can't dispute the will. The will is absolutely copper fastened, right? You can't dispute the will. What he's got to do is try and prove the marriage was bigamous, right? Because if he can prove the marriage to Francis was bigamous, then Sophia loses everything. And that's what he sets out to do. He consults lawyers, he instructs the family, don't play with her, don't talk to her, call her Mrs. Connor. Always call her Mrs. Connor, never call her Countess Annesley, right? Reinforcing to her, we're really going for her here. He goes to the parish priest, he tries to get records of the wedding of Sophia and Connor. He tries to find witnesses of the wedding to try and secure them. He goes to local people who knew her, tries to dig up the dirt. What was she like when she lived here? Did she go out with many boys? All these letters are in the public record office, and they're unbelievable reading. The lengths this man is going to try and discredit her in order to cut her out of the equation. He meets Martin Connor, her alleged husband, to discuss a witness statement with him, tries to dig up any scandal. Now, I can't show you everything, but there's one of the actual letters that he gets. That's from Father Ryan, who's the parish priest, 1797, and this is Father Ryan saying, I wasn't the parish priest at the time. The parish priest was Father Larkin, and Father Larkin told me that he married them, right? So he's now starting to get documentary evidence of this wedding. We look at Earl Annesley and Sophia's side, right? It was Annesley who moved her into Mount Panther, okay? So he moved her into Marlborough Street. She went everywhere with him. He didn't try and hide her. He took her everywhere. He went through the marriage to legitimize the relationship. It wasn't her. He said, I want to marry you. She had no power whatsoever. He called her the Countess Annesley. He called the son Viscount Glenrowley. And he said he knew all the talk was about her, but he dismissed it. In his mind, he was legally married, and she was the countess. And even when he goes with the Downshire militia to Galway during the 1798 rebellion, she's with him. So even on manoeuvres, when he's on manoeuvres with the army, she's with him. She goes everywhere with him, and he gives her land. But then the dirt starts. In 1810, there's a case which involves her. You see, Countess Dowager Annesley. And then it says, now the wife of Edward Smith Lees. So it appears she's either married or not married again. So she's now called Sophia Lees, right? So we've added another name in here. But the interesting thing here is what she's accused of here, and this other woman, Arabella Grove, of murdering 2 people in the hospital in Dublin, and also attempting to murder somebody else. So they bombard her with court cases from everywhere, all sorts of stuff, to try and beat her down. And then comes the case, right? And this is one of the things I want to hang my hat on to say all the books are wrong. There's the case. Sophia Connor stood indicted that being lawfully married to Martin Connor, and well knowing the said Martin Connor was and is alive, that afterward married the Earl Annesley, contrary to statute. Upon this indictment, the prisoner pleaded not guilty. The case, upon behalf of the prosecution, was ably stated by Mr. McNally, after which the first witness was called. Now, 2 things here. Mr. McNally, we'll talk about him in a wee minute, because he's famous, right? But there's the other part of the paper. Look what it says about Sophia. Yesterday came the trial of Sophia Countess Annesley on a charge of bigamy. Now, a charge of bigamy is a criminal charge. If she's convicted of bigamy, she gets 5 years transportation in New South Wales. Bigamy actually used to be a capital offence. You could be executed for bigamy. But she's going to New South Wales. So this is some trial she's now entered into. But look what it says. Her ladyship, attended by Mr. Lees, his brother, several other gentlemen, sat at the Traverses bar. She was dressed in a plain muslin gown, wore a deep black veil and turban, and looked exceedingly well. Yeah. Fair play to her. Get in there and fight them. Get in there and fight them. So this is now the bigamy trial, right? Before it even takes place, another trial has to happen, because somebody tries to kidnap her son and take her son away. And all these allegations are flying that her son's being kidnapped and taken on the coach away from Dublin. The bigamy trial takes place in Dublin, right? In the criminal court in Dublin. And Sophia is prosecuted by a guy called Leonard McNally. Leonard McNally was one of the most notorious informers for the British government during the 1798 rebellion, right? He joined the United Irishmen, but he was an informer. Every meeting he went to, he reported it through the authorities. It was on Leonard McNally's information that they arrested Lord Edward Fitzgerald. It was on Leonard McNally's information that they arrested the whole Dublin contingent of the United Irishmen, which really scuppered the rebellion down south. They only found out he was an informer 20 years after he was dead, right? So he was one of the informers that kept it for so long. He's the person who prosecutes Sophia at her actual trial, and that's Leonard McNally. So the trial goes on. They only call one witness, Mrs. McVeigh. She falls apart in the court. They don't call any other witnesses. They don't put forward any other information. Now, the interesting thing about the trial is it's not taken by the Ansleys. It's taken by a guy called Jeffreys. And Jeffreys is sort of a friend of the Ansleys. So you start to ring alarm bells. If I was convinced that my legacy depended on me proving this, why would I let somebody else take the case? And I think they let somebody else take the case because they were flying a kite, because they didn't think it would actually work, and they didn't want to be tarred with a defeat. Here's the verdict of the case, right? And you'll see the verdict. The jury instantly pronounced a sentence of not guilty, right? And up here as well, Judge Osborne, blah, 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 sentence of not guilty. The prisoner was set free. So she was convicted of bigamy. She goes to court, the case falls apart, and she's acquitted not guilty. Now, there's no appeal, and there's double jeopardy. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but scratch me if that means that the wedding to Martin Connor, whether you believe it happened or believe it didn't happen, in law, did not happen. That means if the wedding did not happen to Martin Connor, she is legally married to Earl Annesley. She is legally the Countess Annesley without a shadow of a doubt. That's some of the other things for the case. And there you have Countess Annesley, recently but now acquitted of bigamy, was of the name Kelly. And I love this, was apparently of humble origin, but being of exquisite beauty, which she still retains in all its original luster. You know? And there's what they say about Richard, right? Not very good. A childish tone, uncommon, offensive. So you can see where the public sympathy goes. All the public sympathy is with her. It's not with the Annesley family in Dublin. Richard Annesley is not liked in Dublin. All the public sympathy is with her, and she's being supported by lots of other lords and ladies about the place who see her being hard done by. Another piece there, just to reinforce it, you can see there the charge of bigamy. Upon the death of the late Earl, his brother Richard assumed the title, placed the nephew, Countess Sophia, at school. And you can see there he was starting to pursue her for a vindication of his rights. And this, to me, is one of the clinkers here. If the jury had returned a verdict of guilty, the marriage of Countess Sophia would have been, of course, nullified and the right of Richard established. But the verdict of acquittal, which has been pronounced, leaves that case to be tried in its own merits. So she is acquitted of bigamy. It's not a bigamous marriage. But what they do, because they can't contest the will, they've now lost the bigamy case, what do? They just bombard her with court cases. Court case, court case, court case. They challenge everything. What they're hoping to do is run out of money. Get her to run out of money, right? And this actually does start to happen. But what she does to escape it, she goes to Paris, right? So she heads up to Paris. Now, I keep saying this, but you have to get this. This is a farmer's daughter from Tyrone, right? She's now moving from Dublin to Paris. And where does she live in Paris? She lives in the same apartments as were occupied by the Duke of Kent, right? So she's not going to Paris to live in a 2 up, 2 down. That's her solicitor's bill, right? And you can see all the court cases all coming up. And that's the bill, that's in Prony. And they're counting up all the money. Her solicitor's bill starts to run to about £50,000-60,000. It's maybe starting to run out of a few friends. Things are starting to get bad. Something needs to happen. So what happens is they call her back from Paris and they say, let's do a deal. And the deal is this. The deal is we will pay all your solicitor's bills, we will pay all your legal costs, we'll give you 200 quid to go back to Paris, and we'll give you an annuity of £455 a year to live in Paris, right? They pay off Mrs. McElroy's 4 sons by £500 each. That deal is in the public record office. So they basically do a deal which she signs away all her legal rights and the rights of her children, who are now dead, by the way. The children there's only one child alive at this stage. 2 other children died quite young. So she signs it away, I think out of desperation. They tell her she's not allowed to come back to Dublin, but she comes back. I found this one. This is 1827, right, which is 8 years after. And it says, the Countess of Annesley has arrived in this country after an absence of 10 years. Her ladyship brought over several French servants, some carriages, horses, a quantity of Parisian furniture, quite unique. If only our city would present a different appearance, fashion the orders of society. She was loved. She was absolutely loved when she lived in Dublin. And this is her coming back now. She only goes back for about a year and then she goes back to Paris again. But as I'm saying, this is a farmer's daughter, right? And the last piece of evidence I want to show you here is, this is 5 years after she dies, right? Which is what, about probably 40 years after the deal's done. This comes up. The 4th Earl William wants a seat in the House of Lords. Not all the lords who had seats in the Dublin Parliament got seats in Westminster, okay? And some of them had to apply. So he's applying to get a seat in Westminster. To do that, he has to prove title. So he goes in front of the law lords to prove title. And the law lords bring up Sophia's marriage to Francis. And they sort of say to him, look, see all your title here, you've seen to have left something out, right? Was Francis not married to a woman called Sophia Kelly? And the solicitor says, yes, but I believe it was a bigamous marriage. So then the solicitor is asked, because I have the transcript, was there any evidence of a marriage to Connor? And the solicitor on oath says, no. Right? So the Lord's declared she was acquitted. They're treating the marriage as valid. So the solicitor has now got to say, before Annesley becomes a lord, you've got to find out her 3 children. Did her 3 children live? Did they have kids? Because if they have kids, they're Earl Annesley, not you. So he's got to go, and he does that quite easily, because 2 of the children die quite young, and the other one dies when he's 14-year-old. He dies in Sandhurst. He's an officer in Sandhurst. So none of her kids reach maturity, and that's how he gets a seat in the House of Lords. So the questions that I can't square with the narrative that's in all these books, and I've some of them here, and some of them are big, big tomes of books, right, written by serious historians. The question I can't square with what they've written. How much of our life is truth, or we don't know. You know, we really don't know. We've got to say, he said, she said, a lot of it, yeah. Was the marriage to Connor legally valid? I don't know. I wasn't there. It might have been, it might not have been. The important thing was, in the eyes of the law, it wasn't. It actually wasn't. It didn't happen. Francis married Sophia in Mount Panther. It wasn't a secret marriage. It wasn't hidden from anybody. He did it in the full glare with the local minister. He called her Sophia, or Countess Annesley, all her life. He called her son, Lord Glen Raleigh, who's the one who inherits the title. At the reading of the will, when the Earl reads the will, everybody there is on the Earl's side apart from one person, and that is Francis's solicitor, the man who wrote the will. He reads the will out. And Richard says to them all when they're in the room, Mount Panther, he says, who is Earl Annesley? I am Earl Annesley. I'm Earl Annesley. I am Earl Annesley. And they all say yes, apart from Francis' solicitor. He doesn't speak. So he says to him directly, will you not say I am the Earl Annesley? And his words are this, if I can remember verbatim what he says. He says, look, Richard, he said, I was your brother's great friend, and I wrote the will. And when I wrote the will, I knew what your brother wanted. He wanted his son to inherit, Sophia's son. But, he says, in what has transpired within this room, he says, I acknowledge your claim. Now, that's hardly a ringing endorsement in anybody's mind, but that was what the solicitor said. At the trial, the bigamy case was taken not by the Annesleys, I think by a guy called Jeffries. Mrs. McVeigh's information fell apart. None of the evidence gathered by Richard, and I have seen the evidence, the written evidence, none of it was submitted at the trial. Not a single thing was produced, because I think they knew it was all nonsense. It was all made up. The 2 Connor brothers were at the trial. Martin Connor, who was meant to be her husband, and his brother Patrick Connor, who meant to be the wedding, were both in the courtroom. They weren't produced. Prosecution didn't produce them. And the only witness the prosecution sent away was Marcus Annesley. And Marcus Annesley was there to prove the second marriage. Because I think what their strategy was, we'll prove the first marriage was bigamous, yeah. Then we bring Martin in. He'll prove the second marriage took place, which means that one has got to fall. He was sent away by the prosecution and he wasn't called. Was she ever married to Sir Edward Lees? I don't know. Sir Edward Lees was the head of the GPO, basically, in Dublin, the post office in Dublin. He was a big, wealthy man. I don't know where they ever were married. I can't find a record of the marriage. And in 1855, the Lord deemed the marriage legal. So, was the marriage to Francis bigamous? I don't think we'll ever know. But in the eyes of the law, she was acquitted. There's no appeal. Double jeopardy applies. So, in my opinion, contrary to all these books, in my opinion, Sophia was the rightful Countess Annesley. Just to finish, because the story's about her, it's not about the Annesleys. Confucius says, may you be born in interesting times. So let's look very quickly through her life. Farmer's daughter, born on a farm in Tyrone, never would have left the parish, married somebody local. What does she see? She lives through and is a first-hand witness to the 1798 rebellion. 1798 rebellion, Down is proclaimed because the biggest number of United Irishmen in any county of the 32 counties is in County Down. County Down is proclaimed in 1776, martial law is there, and the militia and the yeomanry are sweeping County Down, going into farms, pulling pikes out of the thatch, flogging people to death, arresting people, shooting people. Ballyholland, the militia went into Ballyholland and killed about 30 people in Ballyholland outside Newry. Annesley takes her everywhere. He's a colonel in the militia and he's a colonel in the yeomanry. So she's with him when all this is happening, going everywhere when all this is happening. That's a deposition. There's 14 depositions in Pronay for here, this particular area here, all written to Lord Annesley, dobbing people in. This one here is about Drumgoolan, and it's about a guy in Drumgoolan who's saying there's a schoolmaster called Morrow writing about Drumgoolan, writing about Ballyroney, trying to get people to join the United Irishmen, go out in rebellion. Annesley has him arrested and brought into Castlewellan, brought into Mount Panther as well. Now, she's with him at this particular time. She must have been party to this. This is the execution of Lord Edward Fitzgerald. The guy there is called Major Sir. He's in charge of the police in Dublin, and he was a particular friend of hers. She knocked about with him. I have letters from him to her. This is the Battle of Ballynahinch. Battle of Ballynahinch was the last battle fought in the north in the 1780 rebellion. That's Windmill Hill in Ballynahinch. That's Slieve Croob in the back. That's Montalto. If you see the house there in the middle, it's Montalto. That's Macradrawal Parish Church. That's looking down towards Montalto, right? She's living in Mount Panther when the battle takes place. But Clough is 10 miles from Ballynahinch. 10 miles. So she must have seen the rebels fleeing Ballynahinch being pursued by the yeomanry. She must have heard the cannons as they're being fired. She then goes to Dublin. She's in Dublin for the trial of Wolfe Tone, right? Wolfe Tone's arrested, the most famous United Irishman, brought to Dublin for trial. She's there. She's in the Irish House of Commons, right? Because after the 98 rebellion, the British government decided to do away with the Irish Parliament, so they disbanded the Irish Parliament, right? Richard and Francis are both members of the Irish Parliament. So the Irish Parliament's disbanded, that's all their wives up there all looking in. So she's there whenever, with the United Kingdom essentially, is first formed in 1800. In 1803, at the Robert Emmet Rebellion, disastrous rebellion, very few casualties. One famous casualty is a guy called Lord Kilwarden. Lord Kilwarden was the Attorney General for Dublin, and he's pulled out of his carriage by Robert Emmet's men in Dublin, and he's pegged to death. He is the godfather of her second son, right? There's Lord Kilwarden. That's Emmet's trial and execution. So was she at that? If he was the man she sees as responsible for her godfathers, was she there? Emmet is hanged and his head is cut off, decapitated. And then what does she do, right? So she leaves Ireland, complete turmoil after all this. She witnesses all this happening in Ireland, and she goes to France, to the Rue de Rivoli in France. What happens 10 years after she arrives there? A French rebellion. This is Les Miserables. If you've ever seen Les Miserables, where the French had a big revolution. This street that this painting is taken from is the next street to where she's living, right? This is next door to what she's living. If that's not bad enough, 10 years later, the French decide to have another revolution in exactly the same place, and she's living in exactly the same place. So she witnesses this wee person, you know, who never would have left her thing, witnesses all these things in history, touches all these people, Kilwarden, McNally, Sir, all these people are involved in some way in her life. Do you want to see what she looks like? That's not her. I'd love to know what she looks like. I went through all the Annesley pictures, every single picture, and tried to work out. And I got names to all of them apart from one. I think that's Lady Isabella St. Lawrence. So I think that's the one that ran off with the young cavalry officer. But I just thought it's time to sort of set the record straight. And it's time to talk about her story. Because her story, I think, is a remarkable story. Much more interesting than much more interesting than all the Annesleys put together, quite frankly. And it's one of a woman on her own, fighting all this thing. So it's, you know, it's the poor versus the rich, it's Catholic versus Protestant, it's Irish versus English, it's everything is written into her story. It's women versus men. You know, she's really there fighting her case, and she does it remarkably well. And I think fair play to her. So listen, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.